Navy sends submarines to sea as message to China. The Pacific Fleet Submarine Force took the Navy sends submarines to sea as message to China. The Pacific Fleet Submarine Force took the unusual step this month of announcing that all of its forward deployed subs were simultaneously conducting contingency response operations at sea in the Western Pacific, downplaying the notion that Navy forces have been hampered by coronavirus 2019. The sub-force said the missions were mounted in support of the Pentagon's free and open Indo-Pacific policy aimed at countering China's expansionism in the South China Sea. At least 7 submarines, and likely more including all 4 Guam-based attack submarines, the San Diego-based USS Alexandria and multiple Hawaii-based vessels are part of the effort. The action also highlights the Pentagon's desire to be flexible and unpredictable in great power competition with China and Russia. Our operations are a demonstration of our willingness to defend our interests and freedoms under international law, Rear ADM. Blake Converse, Pacific Sub-Force Commander, who is based at Pearl Harbor, said in a May 8 release. Attack submarines maintain an outsized stealth capability to sink ships with torpedoes, fire Tomahawk cruise missiles and conduct covert surveillance while keeping adversaries guessing their location. The Navy recently has maintained a flotilla of warships in the Western Pacific as a show of force and proof that COVID-19 hasn't significantly degraded its capabilities, with the United States and China long trading barbs over military activities in the South China Sea and increasingly so over each other's pandemic response. China has been accused of intensifying its occupation of man-made islands and bullying other nations in the region while much of the world has been focused on the pandemic. Geopolitical intelligence platform Stratfor said that the US and China have maintained a robust operational pace in the South China Sea, amid heightening tensions and COVID-19, signs that point to continued escalation after the virus wanes. When the Navy advertises the presence of its usually unseen submarines, it's often to make a point with an adversary. The Navy released a photo of the Los Angeles-class sub Alexandria transients Apra Harbor in Guam on May 5. As the U.S. military addresses COVID-19 at home, we remain focused on our national security missions around the world, Defense Secretary Mark Esper said the same day. Many countries have turned inward to recover from the pandemic, and in the meantime our strategic competitors are attempting to exploit this crisis to the benefit at the expense of others, Esper said. He accused the Chinese Communist Party of ramping up a disinformation campaign to shift blame for the virus and burnish its image. All the while we continue to see aggressive behavior by the PLA People's Liberation Army in the South China Sea, from threatening a Philippine Navy ship to sinking a Vietnamese fishing boat and intimidating other nations from engaging in offshore oil and gas development. Esper said 2 Navy ships conducted freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea the week before to send a clear message to Beijing that we continue to protect freedom of navigation and commerce for all nations large and small. The guided missile cruiser USS Bunker Hill conducted a FONOP in the Spratly Islands, and the destroyer USS Barry sailed twice through the Taiwan Strait and through the Paracel Islands in disputed territory that China claims as its own. These provocative acts by the US side have seriously violated China's sovereignty and security interests, deliberately increased regional security risks, and could easily trigger an unexpected incident, the South China Morning Post quoted a Chinese military command saying after the Barry's Paracel passage. The aircraft carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt has been sidelined in Guam since late March after experiencing an outbreak of the new coronavirus among its 800-member crew. U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor has been quick to note the ongoing deployment of other assets in the region, including transits of the South China Sea by the littoral combat ship USS Gabrielle Giffords, the destroyer USS Rafael Peralta sailing in the East China Sea, and the destroyer USS McCampbell passing through the Taiwan Strait on Wednesday. The first U.S. Navy submarine named after the state of Delaware was officially welcomed to the fleet over the weekend, the U.S. Department of Defense announced. The USS Delaware, a fast attack submarine, was commissioned administratively and transitioned to normal operations Saturday, Navy officials said in a statement. The submarine is the first Navy vessel to carry the state's name in nearly 100 years, officials said. A public ceremony for the boat had been set for Saturday at the port of Wilmington, but was cancelled last month to protect against the spread of the new coronavirus. Democratic U.S. Sen. Tom Carper said the Navy is looking to celebrate the vessel publicly in the future, news outlets reported. The submarine is longer than a football field, weighs about 7,800 tons, 7,075 metric tons, can stay underwater for up to 3 months and can operate for more than 30 years without refueling, according to the Department of Defense. It is manned by 135 sailors. Jill Biden, the wife of Democratic presidential candidate and former Vice President Joe Biden, sponsored the submarine. She christened the boat at a ceremony in Newport News, Virginia, in 2018. I know this submarine and her crew of courageous sailors will carry the steadfast strength of my home state wherever they go, she said in a statement. Submariners stealthily cruising the ocean deeps, purposefully shielded from worldly worries to encourage undivided focus on the top-secret missions of nuclear deterrence, may be among the last pockets of people anywhere who are still blissfully unaware of how the pandemic is turning life upside down. Mariners aboard ballistic submarines are habitually spared bad news while underwater to avoid undermining their morale, say current and former officers who served aboard France's nuclear-armed subs. So any crews that left port before the virus spread around the globe are likely being kept in the dark about the extent of the rapidly unfurling crisis by the commanders until their return, they say. They won't know, said retired ADM Dominique Salas, who commanded the French ballistic submarine squadron from 2003-2006. The boys need to be completely available for their mission. Speaking exclusively to the Associated Press, Salas said he believes submariners will likely only be told of the pandemic as they head back to port, in the final 2 days of their mission. Those who are at sea don't need this information, said Salas, who also commanded the nuclear-armed French submarine, L'Inflexible. The commander, I think, is doubtless informed about what is happening. I don't think he'll have all the details, he said. The French Navy won't divulge what has or hasn't been said to submarine crews. Nor will it say whether any of the 4 French ballistic submarines, laden with 16 missiles that each can carry 6 nuclear warheads, left harbor before France instituted a nationwide lockdown on March 17. Because the deterrent is wrapped in a bubble of protection and confidentiality, it is impossible to know whether the crews are informed or not of this situation, French Navy spokesman Lieutenant CMDER Olivier Ribard said. French submarine missions last 60 to 70 days with about 110 crew members aboard. So a crew that left at the end of February wouldn't be expected back before the end of April. In that case, they will return to a world changed by the pandemic. On March 1, France had just 130 confirmed COVID-19 cases and 2 deaths. In under a month, those numbers have surged past 2,600 dead and over 40,000 sickened. For most people, the coronavirus causes mild or moderate symptoms, such as fever and cough that clear up in 2 to 3 weeks. But for some, especially older adults and people with existing health problems, it can cause more severe illness, including pneumonia and death. For submariners, the return to land could be a shock. They won't have experienced the crisis as we did, with a bit of fear, the lockdown. So for them it will be quite a surprise. They will learn the history, but it will be a history that is related to them, said a serving officer who was the doctor on the ballistic submarine, Le Triomphant, for 4 years. He spoke to the app on condition that he be identified only by his first name and rank, in accordance with the rules of his branch of the French military. All events that could affect or change the morale of the crew members are kept from him, said the officer, Chief Dr. Gabriel. Since there is no internet, no radio and no television on board, the only news you get comes from messages received by the commander, and the commander filters the messages to not give all of the information to everyone. The doctor was underwater in 2012 when an Islamic extremist killed 3 French paratroopers and later killed a rabbi, his 2 young sons, and grabbed an 8-year-old girl and shot her in the head. Only later did the officer learn of the attacks, so when people talk to me about it, I find it impossible to imagine, he said. The only place where you are really cut off from all information is underwater, because even on a vessel in space there is still the radio, television, the internet, he said. When bombings hit Madrid in 2004, Salas didn't inform submariners who were at sea for the ballistic flotilla that was then under his command. Salas said the situation now will be toughest for any crews that leave harbor in the weeks ahead, because they'll know they are leaving loved ones in the midst of the pandemic and possibly still living in lockdown. The French government has already extended its stay-home orders once, to April 15th, and said it could do so again. Salas said he believes those crews will get regular coronavirus updates, but won't be told of any family deaths until they're returning to the Lyle Long submarine base near Brest in Brittany. Salas was at sea in a sub when his father died. The news was kept from him until he had finished his 60-day mission. No matter how serious an event is, there is nothing a submariner can do about it. And since he cannot do anything, better that he know nothing, Salas said. They know that they won't know and accept it. It's part of our deal. Even before the coronavirus swept the planet, claiming the lives of over 280,000 people and infecting another 4 million worldwide, the US and China treated one another with an overriding aura of suspicion and competition. The 2018 U.S. National Defense Strategy, the Defense Department's policy blueprint, labeled China a revisionist power. Beijing's military modernization has proceeded with the US very much in mind. China's early missteps in containing the virus, however, have turned relations between the two largest economies from competitive to downright adversarial in a short 4 months. Those in the Beltway who believed the US would succeed in an environment where intensive rivalry dominate the US-China relationship in every domain dangerously overestimate Washington's power, underestimate Beijing's capacity to retaliate, and callously dismiss the financial, geopolitical, and diplomatic costs such a rivalry would wreak on both the US and the world. Unfortunately, Washington has yet to prove it is willing or even able to see beyond the current cycle of noise and bombast. US and Chinese officials are using the coronavirus crisis as a cudgel in an antagonistic, geopolitical clash of wills, this when a pandemic should be bringing the intellectual and scientific communities of the two powers together in search of effective treatments and a vaccine. Indeed, with the coronavirus generating harsh reactions in Washington and Beijing and a veritable war of words between senior officials in both countries, a complete decoupling, which would upend the global economy, causing more turmoil in the US labor market, is no longer inconceivable. In fact, discussions about China in Washington are no longer prefaced on begrudging but necessary cooperation, but within the prism of an ideological struggle that will define winners and losers in the 21st century. The one denominator that provided the US and China with a reason to preserve constructive dialogue with one another, a $550 billion trade relationship, is now a main arena for bilateral competition. The Phase 1 trade deal signed between the Trump and Xi administrations is skating on thin ice, with new trade talks postponed for the foreseeable future. Chinese companies are being barred by the Trump administration from U.S. telecommunications infrastructure. At the same time, Beijing is expelling American journalists. According to the Wall Street Journal, the State Department has ordered embassies around the world to form China-centric working groups to monitor Beijing's influence and develop strategies to counteract it. US and Chinese delegations are clashing with greater frequency in international fora, throwing sand in the UN Security Council's gears and complicating the work of the very organizations that are vital to stemming the virus. The frostiness between the US and Chinese governments is devolving to the American and Chinese populations as well, making pragmatic engagement more complicated. 66% of Americans have an unfavorable view of China, while Chinese approval ratings of the U.S. have decreased by nearly 20 percentage points between 2019 and 2020. On the US side, relations US with China are in effect trapped in a vicious cycle. The more the US foreign policy elite views China in exclusively hostile terms, the more likely reflexive anti-China sentiment will grow among the American public. The more this hardline sentiment against China rises in US popular opinion, the harder it will be for US officials to argue effectively for a China strategy based on realism and restraint. The new Cold War narrative is in effect becoming a dangerous self-fulfilling prophecy. Does China have a responsibility to come clean to the world about how it has handled the virus? Most certainly. Should there be some accountability levied on Beijing for the Chinese Communist Party's disinformation campaign and resistance to global assistance? One would have trouble finding anybody in the US today who would disagree. None of this, however, makes the idea of a US-China economic rupture or a Cold War-style containment policy any less of a terrible idea. It's difficult to envision legitimate U.S. complaints such as unfavorable Chinese trading practices, intellectual property theft, and cyber attacks against U.S. infrastructure being addressed, let alone solved, in such an atmosphere. We live in an extremely emotional time. Americans are scared, frustrated, and angry as tens of thousands of the fellow citizens have died and more than 30 million others are rendered jobless in just 6 weeks. Yet it is precisely when emotions are running high when cool-headedness is most needed. There have been countless times in U.S. history: the 2003 war in Iraq, the 2011 NATO intervention in Libya, the 2015 U.S. support for Saudi Arabia's military campaign in Yemen, nation building in Afghanistan, when decisions prefaced on hubris, arrogance, fear, or poor assumptions have cost the United States tremendous human and financial pain for little security benefit. Canceling U.S. debt to China or suing the Chinese Communist Party for compensation are emotional responses that will do nothing to manage the outbreak or rebuild Washington's bilateral relationship with Beijing once the crisis is over. As the U.S. foreign policy establishment debates China policy, it should keep in mind the golden rule: good statecraft requires a calm, measured approach.